I flew home after 14 months away, expecting salt air and a quiet dock. Instead, I got a ribbon cutting on my own island. 31 luxury cabins, fresh-cut sod, still damp smelling like a golf course dropped from the sky. A woman in a linen blazer held giant scissors mid-sentence about untouched natural beauty. I walked up.
Ma'am, you're standing on my property.
She looked me over, work boots, salt-stained jacket, and laughed, loud for the crowd.
Sweetheart, we don't hand out islands to boatmen.
Security, 2 guys in golf shirts, started my way. She didn't know it yet, but under all that fresh sod, my grandfather's 1968 survey stakes were still standing. And I had a folder in my truck, about to ruin her afternoon. What would you do if someone called you a trespasser on your own family's land? Drop where you're watching from, you're going to want to see how this ends. My name is Corwin Ashby Latimer. I'm 52, semi-retired from marine surveying, and until about 4 minutes before that ribbon cutting, I owned an island nobody had ever bothered to fight me for. Egret Hollow Island sits off the coast of Beaufort County, South Carolina, connected to the mainland by a single causeway. My grandfather, Casper Latimer, ran a shrimp boat out of these waters for 40 years. He left me that island the old-fashioned way, a handwritten will in 1961, formalized into a proper notarized deed in 1968. For most of my life, nobody wanted it. It was marsh, mosquitoes, oyster shell that'll cut your foot open if you're not careful. The mainland families who eventually built marsh landing estates around it always called it the worthless side of the water. Funny how worthless land gets very valuable the moment somebody else wants it. I'd been away 14 months on a survey contract up in Alaska, long stretches on the water, satellite phone, no real news from home. When I finally made the drive back down the causeway, I noticed the smell first. Diesel and fresh asphalt, thick enough to coat the back of my throat, completely wrong for a place that should have smelled like pluff mud and low tide. Then the sound, gravel crunching under tires where there used to be sand. Then the sight, my grandfather's dock, gone replaced by a paved cul-de-sac with a sign reading, Egret Hollow Luxury Cabins, presented by Marsh Landing Development Group. I sat in my truck for a long minute. My dog Rigger looked at me like he expected an explanation. I didn't have one. I just said, well, and left it at that. That's the moment I met Priscilla Wexford Hale. Though I didn't know her name yet, just her voice, sharp and carrying, directing security like she owned the tide itself. 3 years earlier, before I'd ever left for Alaska, she'd already shown me who she was. I'd asked the HOA board politely in writing for permission to repair the shared causeway bridge on my own dime. She blocked it, citing a vegetation buffer bylaw that, as far as I could tell, existed nowhere except in her head. Around that same time, the board quietly approved something called a community expansion survey of the island. Nobody told me. Turns out the county's own tax map still carried a boundary error from 1954, and Priscilla's people had decided that error was as good as an invitation. I didn't think much of it back then. You don't expect a clerical typo from the Eisenhower administration to turn into a subdivision. I was wrong. For those keeping score at home, here's the cast me. A man who reads deed language for fun and considers that a personality trait. Priscilla, HOA president, married to a developer, allergic to being told no. My cousin Odalis, a title paralegal who was about to become the most important person in this story, besides me. And Deacon Praiseworth Odom, who I hadn't spoken to in months, but who was about to remind me that a fight like mine rarely belongs to just one family. None of us knew yet how far back this actually went. That part came later. Back at the ribbon cutting, Priscilla had a laminated map ready before I'd even finished introducing myself. She called it the Founder's Plat, a hand-drawn thing with the island folded neatly into Marsh Landing's common area, like somebody had colored it in with a crayon during a board meeting, and called it cartography. "This island," she announced to the crowd loud enough that nobody could pretend not to hear, "has always belonged to the community. I'm afraid you're trespassing." Sheriff Talmadge Younce showed up within 10 minutes. Somebody's neighbor must have called it in as a disturbance. He's not the type to take sides before he's seen paperwork, which, credit to him, is exactly what a sheriff should be. He's got that unhurried way of talking that makes everyone around him slow down too, even Priscilla, who visibly hated having to wait for anything. "Sir," he said to me, "you got anything showing ownership?" I didn't have the good stuff on me yet, but I had my phone, and on it, a certified copy of the county tax parcel record, showing the island under its own separate parcel ID, still billed every single year to the Latimer estate. Not conclusive, but enough to make Priscilla's security guys back off, and enough to buy me room to breathe. Priscilla wasn't about to let that stand unanswered. Anybody can pull up a screenshot, Sheriff. That map, she tapped the laminated plat like it was scripture, is the official community document. Younce looked at both of us, unbothered, chewing on nothing in particular. Screenshots and laminate. Y'all give me something with a recording stamp on it by end of week, or take it to the courthouse yourselves. Then he tipped his hat and walked off, leaving both of us mid-argument, which I have to admit was the most diplomatic way I've ever seen someone end a fight. Here's the thing worth knowing if you ever find yourself in a standoff like this. An HOA can print whatever map it wants on whatever fancy paper it wants. It can laminate it, frame it, hang it in the clubhouse next to a photo of somebody's prize azaleas. None of that outranks a deed filed at the county courthouse. A plat map is an internal HOA document. A deed is a legal instrument of record. When they disagree, the deed wins, provided you can prove it's on file, which meant my next stop wasn't a lawyer's office. It was the Register of Deeds. A homeowners association can draw whatever lines it wants on a laminated map. It can't outrank a deed filed at the courthouse. Priscilla wasn't finished, though. As Sheriff Younce walked back to his cruiser, she caught my eye and said, "Sweet as you like, I'll just let the board handle this properly." It wasn't a retreat. It was a threat wearing a cardigan. The asphalt smell was still thick in the air, mixing now with somebody's grilled shrimp from the buffet table. And for a second, the absurdity of it hit me. A knife fight breaking out at a garden party. Somewhere behind Priscilla, a caterer kept refilling a punch bowl like none of this was happening, which in a way was its own kind of comedy. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the marsh smell wash the asphalt out of my lungs. Rigger rode shotgun, unbothered, the way dogs are when they haven't yet realized their whole world just got more complicated. The certified mail arrived 4 days later. Not from a lawyer, but from the HOA board itself, on letterhead so crisp it practically crackled when I opened it. They were formally noticing me of a community expansion review, retroactive to 18 months prior, and reminding me that failure to respond within 30 days would result in the matter being resolved administratively. Bureaucratic language for "we'll take it and dare you to stop us." I sat at my kitchen table that night with the letter, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee gone cold before I'd taken a second sip. My grandfather used to say that paperwork was just another kind of fishing. You don't win by yelling at the water, you win by knowing exactly where to drop your line. I decided that night I was done reacting to Priscilla's moves, one at a time. I needed to see the whole board, and I needed somebody who could read this stuff faster than I could. The next certified letter hit harder. The HOA board was demanding $47,000 in retroactive common area assessment fees for the island dating back to when the expansion survey first happened. Attached was a lien notice polite typed and about as threatening as a document can be while still using the word sincerely. Worse than the number was what I learned when I drove out to the sales office to see the situation with my own eyes. Of the 31 cabins, 22 were already under contract. Families with young kids, retirees downsizing, a couple from Ohio who'd told the sales rep they'd always dreamed of island access. They believed in good faith that they were buying into something legitimate. The sales rep, a cheerful kid who couldn't have been older than 25, showed me a glossy brochure with a photo of my own dock on the cover, retouched so the old boards looked brand new. I didn't have the heart to tell him yet. Priscilla's smugness made a lot more sense once I understood the math. She wasn't just defending a boundary line, she was defending 22 closings and whatever commission structure sat behind Marsh Landing Development Group. I needed help, and I needed it from someone who spoke fluent bureaucracy. That's when I called my cousin, Odalis Ferreira, a title search paralegal who'd spent a decade doing exactly this kind of digging for real estate attorneys in Charleston. She met me at the Register of Deeds office the following Tuesday, coffee in hand, already skeptical of the whole story, until she saw the tax parcel numbers herself. "You want the full chain?" she said, flipping through microfiche like she'd done it 1,000 times, which she had. Every deed, every transfer, every correction back as far as it goes. The Register of Deeds office smelled like old paper and toner, the particular dry dust scent of a building that's been storing county records since before either of us was born. Fluorescent light hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a copier jammed, and someone swore quietly. A chain of title, for anyone who's never had to pull one, is exactly what it sounds like. The full unbroken record of who owned a piece of land, going back through every sale, inheritance, and correction on file at the courthouse. Gaps or clerical mistakes, like a wrong boundary line drawn on a 1954 tax map, don't erase what's actually recorded. They just sit there, waiting for somebody to notice them. Takeaway tax maps are drawn by clerks. Deeds are drawn by lawyers and filed by courts when they disagree the courthouse wins. Odalis found the 1954 error within an hour, exactly where Priscilla's founder's plat had clearly been traced from. "Look at this," she said, spinning the microfiche reader toward me. "Somebody in 1954 drew this boundary freehand off a survey that was already known to be wrong. And your HOA's plat map traces this exact same mistake 60 years later. They didn't discover anything, they just copied a typo." But she also found something odd tucked into the same file. A name on a 1954 transfer document that had no business being there at all, cross-referenced against a name that would matter a lot more later. She frowned at it for a long moment, tapping her pen against the desk. She looked up from the microfiche reader, glasses pushed up on her forehead, and said, "Corwin, I think this is bigger than a boundary dispute." I asked her what she meant, and she just shook her head. "Give me a few more days. I don't want to say it out loud until I'm sure." I drove home, not knowing quite what to feel. Anger mostly, but also something lighter underneath it. The specific relief of realizing you're not crazy, that the ground really had shifted under you, and you weren't just imagining it. For the first time since I'd gotten home, I felt something other than anger. I felt curious. Before I left the courthouse that day, Odalis pulled one more thing out of the file box, almost as an afterthought, a faded photograph clipped to a 1968 survey report, black and white, curling at the corners. My grandfather, maybe 40 years old, standing knee-deep in marsh grass, next to a man in a county surveyor's uniform, both of them grinning like they'd just settled a bet. On the back, in pencil, somebody had written a date and 3 words: "Boundary finally right." I sat with that photograph longer than I probably needed to. There's something about seeing proof that a fight you're in the middle of has already been fought once before, by somebody who loved this land as much as you do, and won. It doesn't make the current fight easier, but it makes it feel less lonely. While Odalis kept digging, Priscilla went to work on my reputation. The HOA newsletter, normally full of pool schedule updates and lost cat flyers, ran a full page under the headline, "Community Growth Threatened by Property Dispute." It painted me as a squatter, unstable, resistant to progress. At the clubhouse, she made sure to mention within earshot of anyone who'd listen that I was just a boatman who didn't understand how a real community works. Petty power dressed up as concern for the neighborhood. I felt it the next time I walked into the general store. Conversations went quiet. A few people who used to wave now suddenly found something interesting to look at on their phones. It's a particular kind of loneliness being turned into a cautionary tale in your own hometown. The bell over the door used to mean somebody would holler my name across the aisles. Now it just meant a room going a half shade quieter. But word travels both directions on a marsh. Deacon Praiseworth Odom, who'd known my grandfather since before I was born, heard what was happening and came to find me instead of avoiding me. He runs the church on the mainland side, and a good chunk of the historically black fishing families in the area trace their own land back the same way my family did. Handshake agreements formalized into deeds decades before anybody thought a lawyer was necessary. "You're not the only one they've tried this with," he told me over coffee, "that actually stayed warm for once. Just the first one dumb enough to still have his paperwork." That hit different than any insult Priscilla had thrown. It meant this wasn't really about me. Several families in his congregation had quietly fielded their own vague expansion letters from HOA-adjacent developers over the years. Nothing as bold as 31 cabins, but the same pattern testing whether anyone would push back. Deacon Odom pulled a folder of his own from his jacket, worn soft at the corners, full of letters going back almost a decade. "We kept copies," he said. "Nobody ever asked us for them. Guess it's time somebody did." Meanwhile, Odalis uncovered something that would matter more than any newsletter smear: environmental permits filed by Marsh Landing Development Group, describing the island as unoccupied, undeveloped land. Convenient if you're trying to fast-track construction permits. Less convenient once you remember the county still bills that exact land to the Latimer estate every single year. When a company tells the government the land is empty and tells buyers it's already theirs, somebody's lying to somebody, and paperwork doesn't forget. I stopped reacting to each new insult individually that week. Every rumor, every dirty look at the store, every line in that newsletter. I started treating it less like a wound and more like evidence of how nervous they actually were. Confident people don't need to run smear campaigns. They just show their paperwork. The following Sunday, Deacon Odom stood up during announcements, and without naming Priscilla directly, mentioned that a member of the congregation was dealing with a land matter that might interest a few other families. 6 people stayed after service to talk. 6 turned into 11 by the following week. What had started as one man's fight over one island was quietly becoming something with a lot more witnesses. I drove home that evening past the cabin's windows down again, and noticed the marsh smell had come back. Sulfur and salt, the tide doing what it's done for 10,000 years, regardless of what any HOA board decided to build on top of it. Small comfort, but a real one. Somewhere off in the reeds, a night heron let out that low, cranky croak they do, and it was the first thing all week that had made me laugh out loud, alone in my own truck. Not everyone at the store had gone quiet either, that's worth saying, since it would have been easy to let the cold shoulders define the whole week. The woman who ran the register, a widow who'd known my mother, slipped an extra pack of crackers into my bag without ringing them up, and said, low enough that only I could hear, "Don't you let that woman make you small, Corwin Latimer. You come from people who built this coastline with their hands." I didn't have a clever response for that. I just said thank you, and meant it more than she probably realized. Odalis called me on a Thursday night, and I could hear in her voice she'd found something. The 1954 error wasn't an accident, she said. It was the result of an actual boundary dispute, an informal one, the kind that used to get settled with a handshake and a lawyer nobody wrote down. Your grandfather settled his version of it in 1968. That's why the notarized deed exists. He didn't just refile the boundary. He had a full meets and bounds survey attached, naming Egret Hollow Island specifically, and severing it permanently from any claim the mainland side might make. That alone would have been enough. It wasn't the whole story. There's a clause, she said, buried in the fine print, a reverter clause. I'd heard the term before, vaguely, from my surveying work, but never seen one used like this. A reverter clause is a landowner's way of building a promise directly into the land itself. If a certain condition is broken, ownership of a specified piece of property automatically reverts back to the original owner or their heirs. In my grandfather's 1968 deed, the condition was simple. If the mainland parcel was ever developed in a way that infringed on the Latimer family's marsh access rights, a defined buffer strip along the water would revert to the island parcel, permanently. No lawsuit required to create the right, just one required to enforce it. A reverter clause is a landowner's way of saying, break this promise and the land comes back to me. Odalis read me the legal description over the phone, slow enough for me to plot it out on an old topo map spread across my kitchen table. Pencils scratching against paper the particular smell of the old map itself. Musty, slightly sweet, like it had been folded in a drawer for decades, which it had. When I lined up the coordinates against what I'd seen at the ribbon cutting, my stomach dropped in the good way. The way it does right before you land a fish you've been chasing all season. Corwin, she said, and I could hear her double-checking her own math, even as she said it. 9 of the 31 cabins sit inside that buffer strip. 9 of them Corwin. Not maybe, not close to the line, inside it. I sat there for a while after we hung up, not saying anything, just looking at my grandfather's handwriting on the photocopy Odalis had sent over. The same careful block letters he used to write out shrimp tallies on the dock, ink gone brown with age but still perfectly legible. I wasn't celebrating yet. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like my grandfather reaching across 60 years to tell me he'd already thought of this long before I was born, long before Priscilla Wexford Hale ever set foot on that island. Rigger put his head on my knee. I scratched his ears and said, "Grandpa was smarter than all of us." Outside, the tide had gone all the way out, leaving that particular low-tide hush over the marsh. No lapping water, just wind through Spartina grass and the occasional pop of a fiddler crab retreating into its hole. It felt for the first time in weeks like the island itself was on my side, patiently waiting for me to catch up to what it had known all along. Knowing you're right and proving it in a way a judge will respect are two very different jobs. I needed a team and I needed them fast, because Priscilla wasn't going to slow down just because I'd found a folder full of good news. O'Dallas handled the legal side, obviously, but she also pulled in Wendell Cargill, a retired land surveyor who'd worked alongside my grandfather decades earlier, and still had a transit sitting in his garage like a trophy. Wendell agreed to rerun the original 1968 meets and bounds survey using modern GPS equipment, partly to satisfy the court, and partly, I think, because he wanted an excuse to prove his old hand calculations were still dead accurate. They were down to the inch, which delighted him more than it should have. "Back in my day," he told me, hauling equipment out of a truck bed that smelled faintly of motor oil and cut grass, "we didn't have satellites telling us where the dirt was. We had a good eye, a steady hand, and enough common sense not to argue with a compass." Then his GPS unit beeped out coordinates matching his 1968 numbers almost exactly, and he just grunted and packed the tripod away, refusing to say another word about it for the rest of the afternoon. Deacon Odom brought the community side. The families who'd stayed after service kept showing up not to protest, not to make noise, just to be present, and if it came to it, to testify to a pattern of land disputes that stretched well beyond my one island. We started meeting at his church on Wednesday evenings, folding chairs set up in a circle, coffee and styrofoam cups, everybody comparing old letters and older deeds like a strange kind of potluck. Here's the part people get wrong about a fight like this. The instinct is to want a dramatic confrontation, a shouting match, something cinematic. What actually works is duller and far more effective. You don't sabotage anything. You don't cut anyone's fence. You file. We quietly recorded the corrected deed and the new GPS survey with the County Register of Deeds, making both part of the permanent public record before any hearing ever happened. Then O'Dallas filed something called a quiet title action. A quiet title action is exactly what it sounds like. A lawsuit asking a court to formally and permanently settle who owns a piece of land when there's a competing claim resulting in a binding public order that ends the argument for good. Unlike a private settlement, it can't quietly disappear into a confidential agreement. It has to happen somewhere a judge signs their name, where the record can see it. You don't have to out-yell an HOA. You just have to out-file them. We asked the county to schedule an actual public hearing, rather than pushing for a closed-door resolution, which is exactly the kind of move that makes a board like Priscilla's very uncomfortable. Public hearings don't come with a PR team. Wendell grumbled through most of the survey work, muttering that a good transit and a straight eye used to be enough right up until his old hand-calculated numbers matched the GPS coordinates to within a hair. He wouldn't admit he was impressed. He just packed up his equipment and said, "Well, Grandpa Latimer taught me that boy right." By the end of that week, the hearing date was set. Somebody in the clerk's office, without meaning to hand me a gift, scheduled it for the exact same week as the HOA's planned grand opening celebration for the finished cabins. I didn't ask them to change it. The days leading up to it had a strange, quiet rhythm. I spent mornings out on the water, checking crab pots the way I always had, letting the marsh do what it does best, remind you that some things are bigger and slower and more patient than any HOA meeting. Diesel gave way again to salt and pluff mud, and it felt oddly like the island was breathing easier the closer we got to the hearing. In the afternoons, I reviewed exhibits with O'Dallas at her kitchen table, the smell of strong coffee and highlighter ink becoming as familiar as diesel and asphalt had been at the start of all this. One evening near the end of that stretch, O'Dallas found me sitting on the dock with the whole exhibit binder open on my lap, rereading my grandfather's deed for probably the 40th time. She sat down next to me without saying anything for a while, just watching the water. "You know this isn't really about the island anymore, right?" she finally said. "Not just the island. I told her I knew. It hadn't been not since Deacon Odom showed me that folder of letters from families who'd never gotten this far. Winning my case was always going to matter, winning it loud enough that other people felt safe pulling their own old deeds out of drawers that mattered more. She tried to buy her way out first. Bertram Wexford Hale, Priscilla's husband, and as it turned out, the quiet money behind Marsh Landing Development Group, showed up at my place unannounced with a folder of his own, a cash buyout offer for the island, dressed up in real estate speak about avoiding unnecessary conflict and moving forward as neighbors. The number was well below market value, insultingly so if I'm honest though. I kept my face as flat as the marsh at low tide. He stood on my porch in a golf polo that probably cost more than my truck payment, sweating a little in the humidity, clearly uncomfortable being anywhere near actual salt water and mosquitoes. "Corwin," he said, using my first name like we were old friends, which we weren't. "Let's not make this ugly. This number's more than fair." I told him I'd think about it. I didn't mean a word of it, but I wasn't about to tip my hand about the reverter clause, the quiet title filing, or the hearing date bearing down on him faster than he realized. Sometimes the smartest move is letting somebody stay confident right up until the moment they shouldn't be. That confidence curdled fast. 2 nights later, somebody cut the padlock on the causeway gate, the one separating my grandfather's old property line from the construction access road, and accidentally widened the opening enough for delivery trucks to pass through without permission. Sheriff Younce came out again, and this time the incident became something more useful than an inconvenience, an official report, dated, signed, filed. If you're ever documenting a dispute like this, understand that every incident report you generate is a small brick in a much bigger wall. A single trespass might look like a misunderstanding. A pattern of them backed by paperwork looks like exactly what it is. Takeaway: every incident report is a receipt. Save your receipts. The smell that morning was diesel again, sharp and wrong, mixed with the metallic tang of the cut padlock still lying in the gravel where whoever did it had dropped it in a hurry. I photographed everything before Younce even arrived. The cut shackle, the tire ruts through what used to be my grandfather's fence line, the boot prints in the mud. My grandfather always said, "A good surveyor documents first and reacts second." Turns out that habit's useful for more than just property lines. O'Dallas, digging through public county filings that same week, found the real motive behind Bertram's sudden generosity. Marsh Landing Development Group was quietly trying to fast-track final closings on the remaining 9 unsold cabins, the same 9 sitting inside the reverter buffer, before the hearing could touch them. Bertram wasn't being neighborly. He was trying to outrun a deadline he didn't know I already knew about. I didn't confront him about the buyout offer directly. I let a few days pass, sent a polite, non-committal text saying I needed more time to think it over, and watched through public filings O'Dallas kept monitoring as his closing dates kept creeping earlier and earlier on the calendar. Panic, it turns out, leaves a paper trail too. By the time the hearing was 1 week out, Bertram had pushed for 3 closings in 4 days. Buyers who thought they were getting a dream vacation home had no idea they were racing a deadline that had already legally expired the moment my grandfather's ink dried on a deed in 1968. O'Dallas printed the closing schedule and set it next to the reverter clause on her kitchen table. Side by side, like 2 halves of the same joke nobody at Marsh Landing had realized they were the punchline of yet. There was one more twist that week that I still think about. One of the buyers rushing toward closing, a retired school teacher from Ohio, the same one who'd mentioned island access to the sales rep, actually called me directly. Somebody had given her my number, probably by accident. She wasn't hostile. She sounded scared. "I just want to know if I'm about to lose my life savings," she said. I told her as gently as I could to hold off signing anything until after the hearing. I didn't know Marsh Landing Development Group a single thing, but I wasn't about to let an innocent retiree walk into a mess she had no way of seeing coming. She thanked me, voice shaking a little, and I hung up feeling like maybe this fight had more than one kind of winning built into it. Priscilla's last real weapon was the story itself, and she used it well. The local paper ran a piece sympathetic, uncritical, exactly the kind of thing that happens when a reporter's on deadline and one side answers the phone faster than the other. It painted the HOA as the victim framed me as a greedy landowner trying to strangle a beloved community project in its crib, and conveniently left out anything about deeds, surveys, or reverter clauses. For a few days it worked. A couple of longtime neighbors who used to wave at me from their porches started finding reasons to be somewhere else when I walked by. That's the part nobody warns you about in a fight like this. It's not just the villain's cruelty that stings, it's watching good people get talked into believing the wrong version of events simply because it arrived first and sounded reasonable. I didn't call the reporter to complain. I let the record do what records do. O'Dallas and I finalized the exhibit list that week, the corrected 1968 deed with its reverter clause, Wendell's GPS survey proving 9 cabins sat inside that buffer, the falsified environmental permits calling my island unoccupied, undeveloped land, and the incident reports documenting the cut padlock and the unauthorized road widening. Laid out together on her dining table, color-coded tabs sticking out of every folder, it wasn't a story anymore. It was a paper trail with no other reasonable explanation. A smear campaign only works until the paperwork shows up. The turning point in public opinion came oddly enough at the general store. I overheard the owner, a blunt, sun-cured man who'd sold my grandfather bait for 30 years, telling another customer that any story that convenient probably ain't the whole story, while ringing up a bag of boiled peanuts, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Word like that travels faster on a marsh than any newspaper, faster even than Priscilla's newsletter. And by the next morning, I noticed a couple of those porch neighbors waving again, a little sheepishly, like they knew they owed me an apology they weren't quite ready to say out loud yet. That Sunday, Deacon Odom organized a town meeting at the church. Not to argue my case for me, but to let the mainland families who'd approached him speak for themselves. Sharing their own family deed histories, their own quiet run-ins with HOA-adjacent developers over the years. The fellowship hall smelled like church basement coffee and lemon bars, folding chairs scraping against linoleum as more people kept arriving than anyone had planned for. By the time the meeting ended, the sympathy Priscilla had borrowed from the newspaper had mostly evaporated, replaced by something more durable. A community starting to recognize its own story reflected in mine. The morning of the hearing arrived. Cool and still fog sitting low over the marsh, the way it does maybe a dozen times a year, muffling every sound until even the gulls seemed to be whispering. Somewhere across the water I could hear the faint sound of a brass band tuning up. Priscilla's ribbon-cutting celebration for the finished cabins, scheduled by pure county clerk coincidence for the exact same morning. I put on the one collared shirt I owned that didn't have a fish stain on it, packed the exhibit folder into my truck. The same folder I'd promised back at that first ribbon cutting was about to ruin somebody's afternoon, and drove toward Marsh Landing Estates one more time. Judge Marguerite Sable made an unusual call that morning. Given the number of interested parties, and frankly the optics of holding a quiet courthouse hearing while half the county celebrated a ribbon cutting a few miles away, she agreed to convene the public session directly at the Marsh Landing Clubhouse, the same building where Priscilla's celebration was already in full swing. I want you to picture it. String lights still up from the party, a brass band mid-song, champagne glasses catching the morning sun. And Priscilla at the podium, scissors in hand, again mid-sentence about a community built on vision and unity, when the county process server walked in through the front doors, followed by Judge Sable's clerk. The band didn't even finish the note it was on. It just sort of trailed off, one trumpet holding a note a beat too long into the silence, which somehow made the whole thing funnier and worse at the same time. We laid it out plainly right there, in front of everyone who mattered. HOA members, reporters who'd shown up for a puff piece and got a real story instead, and the mainland families who'd driven over together after Deacon Odom's town meeting. The corrected 1968 deed, the reverter clause, read aloud, plain English, no legal fog, Wendell's GPS survey overlaid on a printed map, so even the people in the back row could see 9 cabins sitting squarely inside land that legally wasn't Marsh Landing's to build on. The falsified permits calling the island unoccupied. The incident reports laid out one by one, like a hand of cards nobody at that podium wanted to see turned over. Judge Sable didn't need long to deliberate. She'd clearly read every page beforehand. Standing at that same clubhouse podium, still decorated with the HOA's own ribbon-cutting banner, she ruled that ownership of the defined buffer strip and the land beneath 9 of the finished cabins reverted to Corwin Ashby Latimer under the terms of the 1968 deed, effective immediately. She referred the falsified environmental permit filings to the state for further investigation, her tone even and unhurried, like she was reading off a grocery list instead of ending somebody's empire. I watched Priscilla's face do something I hadn't seen it do in 3 years of knowing her crack. The practiced smile held for maybe half a second too long, then gave out completely, right in front of the 22 buyers she'd personally reassured, right in front of the reporters, right in front of her own husband, who quietly stepped back from the podium mic like it had suddenly gotten hot. 40 people went silent at once. The only sound was a single drop champagne flute somewhere near the buffet table glass, scattering across the same fresh sod that had smelled like a golf course dropped from the sky the day this whole thing started. Somebody's kid laughed too young to understand what had just happened, and the sound cut through the silence like the only honest thing left in the room. I didn't gloat. Didn't need to. I just said, calm as I could manage, you can build 31 cabins in 6 months. You can't outbuild 60 years of paperwork. The rest of the morning moved in that strange, muted way big moments do. Reporters scribbling a few of the mainland families, quietly shaking my hand. Sheriff Younce giving me a small professional nod that said more than words would have. Priscilla left through a side door before the band ever picked the song back up. Bertram trailing a few steps behind her, already on the phone with someone, voice low and clipped. One of the 22 buyers, the retired school teacher who'd called me the week before, found me in the parking lot afterward. She didn't say much, just squeezed my arm and said thank you for telling me to wait. I told her the fund would make sure everyone in a situation like hers got treated fairly going forward, and for the first time all morning, I saw somebody smile at me instead of through me. Here's what I didn't expect winning didn't feel like winning. It felt like a responsibility I hadn't asked for. I could have sold those 9 reverted cabins. Market value alone would have set me up comfortably for the rest of my life. Instead, Odalis Deacon Odom and I sat down at that same kitchen table, where this whole thing had turned a corner. Coffee gone cold again, legal pad covered in numbers, and we decided to place the land in a community land trust instead. Not a personal payday, a foundation. We named it the Casper Latimer Marsh Conservation and Scholarship Fund, after my grandfather. Land lease income from those 9 cabins now funds college scholarships for kids from the mainland fishing families, the same families whose own quiet land disputes had never made it to a courtroom, and protects a stretch of tidal marsh from ever being paved over again. The first scholarship went to a 17-year-old from Deacon Odom's congregation who wants to study environmental law. I like to think my grandfather would have found that funny in the best possible way. The HOA didn't survive the fallout in its old form. A member recall vote restructured the board within 2 months. Priscilla resigned before the vote could formally remove her, which everybody understood for what it was. I spent a Saturday not long after out on the dock, replacing the boards that construction crews had torn up without asking. Just me, a hammer, salt air, and riggers sprawled in a patch of sun, mostly supervising and occasionally getting in the way. The smell of fresh-cut cedar mixed with the low-tide sulfur smell that had greeted me the day I came home, and for the first time in months, both of them smelled like exactly what they were supposed to. No cameras, no crowd, just fixing something with my hands the way my grandfather taught me to. A few weeks later, the mainland families and the island side finally shared something other than a courtroom. A low-country boil, right there on the repaired dock, shrimp and corn and potatoes steaming in the evening air. The smell of Old Bay drifting out over water that didn't care one bit about any of this, and never had. Kids running around who'd probably never think twice about which side of the water their family history started on. Whatever Karen versus underdog framing this story might carry from the outside, that evening it just looked like a neighborhood. Which honestly, is all it ever needed to be. Wendell still comes by every few months to check his old numbers. Which really just means he wants an excuse to sit on the dock and complain about GPS satellites some more. Deacon Odom's congregation now has a standing invitation to fish the island waters whenever they like. No causeway gate, no lock, nothing but an open gate and a sign my grandfather would have approved of. Welcome, neighbors. As for Priscilla, last I heard she'd moved 2 counties over. I don't wish her ill. I just wish she'd learned the lesson a little earlier, that petty power dressed up in a nice blazer is still just petty power, and paperwork has a very long memory. I've got another one queued up for you, by the way. A lighthouse dispute so strange I'm still not sure who technically owns it. That's a story for another day. If your HOA has ever tried something like this, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments below. And if you like stories where the paperwork wins in the end, go ahead and hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. So that's how it ended. 9 cabins reverted. $47,000 in fake fees gone. And a woman who spent 3 years abusing a little bit of power watched it disappear in front of a live crowd at her own ribbon cutting. But here's the part of Corwin's story that stuck with me long after the courtroom cleared. Corwin didn't win because he yelled the loudest. He won because 60 years earlier, his grandfather sat down and did something most of us never do. He read the fine print, and he made sure it would still protect his family long after he was gone. That's the real lesson buried in this one. Power that isn't backed by paperwork is just noise. Priscilla had a laminated map and a loud voice. Corwin had a deed with his grandfather's actual handwriting on it. One of those things holds up in front of a judge. The other one doesn't. And notice what Corwin did once he won. He didn't cash out. He turned 9 cabins into scholarships for kids who'll never have to fight this fight the way he did. That's not revenge. That's patience, finally paying somebody else forward. Now, maybe you've never owned an island. I sure haven't. But I'd bet a good number of you have gotten a letter from an HOA that felt just as unfair as that $47,000 bill. A fine that made no sense. A rule that got enforced on you and nobody else. So here's my question for you if your HOA tried something like this tomorrow. Do you actually know where your deed is? Tell me in the comments, has your HOA ever tried to pull something like this? I read every single one. If this story got under your skin the right way, hit subscribe, because HOA Stories has a lot more where this came from, including next week's story about a lighthouse nobody can prove anyone actually owns. Because at the end of the day, they can build whatever they want. They just can't outbuild the paperwork.